The sun is down, the house is quiet, and you are not as alone as you think. Welcome to Ghostly Tales. I'm your host, Mel, and these are stories meant for the dark and for those brave enough to listen to them.
The house that always watched me. When I was a kid, I lived in a house that always felt a little off. A lot of nights I would hear footsteps coming up to my bed. I would lie there frozen, listening, but my parents never believed me. One night, I heard a voice as clear as day say hello right next to my bed. I couldn't move and didn't say anything. From then on, I would have nightmares almost every night. The house always left a feeling of being watched. Even when nothing happened, the air felt different, heavy and strange, like it was always aware of me. These things went on until we moved. I will never forget the feeling I had, especially at night when I was trying to fall asleep. The deer in the woods. When I was about 12, I used to visit my uncle's house. He had acres of land surrounded by woods that seemed to go on forever. I loved exploring out there, especially this one quiet creek tucked deep in the trees. One afternoon, I stayed out longer than usual. The sun was sinking, and when I realized how dark it was getting, I decided to head back fast. The woods felt different as the light faded, quieter and heavier somehow. As I walked, I kept hearing something behind me. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own footsteps, but the sound didn't match. It was slower and more deliberate. I stopped to listen, and when I turned toward the noise, I saw a deer standing between the trees. It was staring straight at me. Its eyes were dark, almost too dark, and it didn't move at all. I had seen deer out there plenty of times, but something about this one made my stomach twist. I turned and picked up my pace, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. A few minutes later, I glanced back again and froze. The deer was closer, but it didn't look the same. Its skin looked loose, like it didn't quite fit right, and its body seemed to bend in places it shouldn't. It wasn't standing right anymore. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran the rest of the way back to the house, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I never told anyone, but I stopped going to that creek after that. Sometimes I still think about those woods and how quiet they were that evening, right before I realized the thing watching me wasn't just a deer. Through the radio. When I was a kid, my sister and I were arguing over the radio station when suddenly a voice screamed my name through the speakers. We both froze. The argument vanished in an instant as we stared at each other, confused and scared. We thought maybe our dad had come home early from work, but the house was empty. We never fought over the radio again after that. The reason I never play games late at night anymore. It was late, and I was playing on my computer with my headset on so I wouldn't wake anyone in the house. The only light was from my screen, and the house was completely quiet. I'd been playing for a while when I started to hear something faint in my headphones. It sounded like a man's voice, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. At first, I thought it was part of the game, maybe some random background sound, but it didn't fit. I could tell he was talking about a house. That made no sense. I paused the game, checked my tabs, and made sure nothing else was running. Everything looked normal. After a few minutes of silence, I went back to playing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. Clear this time. Low and close. Who's in the house? It was so real and sudden that I jumped out of my chair. My heart was pounding. I exited the game and pulled my headset off. The room was completely still. I felt this heavy, uncomfortable pressure, like someone was standing just out of view, watching. I'll never forget that feeling.
The apartment just wasn't right. I used to live alone in a small apartment on the second floor of an older building. It was quiet, and I actually liked that about it. At first, it felt peaceful. Then, little things started to happen. Lights would turn on in rooms I hadn't been in. Small objects would be out of place. I'd find my keys on the floor, or a book sitting where I knew I hadn't left it. My cat was the first one to really notice. She'd stare into corners, like she was watching something move. Sometimes she'd suddenly run out of a room like she'd been startled. I tried to tell myself she was just being a cat, but over time, it got harder to ignore. Then the doors started slamming. I'd be sitting in the living room and hear one shut hard down the hallway. I'd check, thinking maybe a draft caused it, but the windows were closed. One night, I heard footsteps. Not slow or hesitant ones. Running. From one side of the apartment to the other. My cat was beside me on the couch, wide-eyed, her fur standing up. After that night, the apartment felt heavier. The air felt different, thick somehow. Picture frames started falling off the walls. I'd wake up feeling watched. Sometimes the room would get cold for no reason. And more than once, I could swear I heard breathing that wasn't mine. I decided to move, but I had to wait a month for my lease to end. Those weeks dragged on. Every night the unease got worse. My cat refused to come into the bedroom, and I barely slept. The day I left that apartment was the best I felt in a long time. I didn't even look back when I closed the door. The night the toys started talking. It started with the toys. My toddler had a few that made sounds when you pressed buttons or moved them, but they began going off by themselves, in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just weak batteries or maybe a glitch. I'd get up, turn them off, and try to go back to sleep. Then I started hearing voices on the baby monitor. Not the usual static or background noise, but actual voices. Sometimes it sounded like whispering, other times like someone quietly talking to my child. Each time I rushed in, but there was never anyone there. My toddler would just be sitting up in bed, wide awake, and staring toward the corner of the room. After that, bedtime became difficult. My toddler didn't want to sleep in their room anymore. Every night they cried and begged me to stay. I started sitting in the chair by the bed until they fell asleep, just to help them feel safe. One night, I must have fallen asleep too. When I woke up, the room was cold and silent. My eyes adjusted, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure was standing right beside the bed. It wasn't moving, just watching. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but as soon as I startled and sat up, it was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I picked up my toddler and took them straight to my room. From that night on, they slept with me until we moved out. I don't know what it was in that apartment, but I still get chills when I think about it. Sometimes, even now, I'll hear one of those same toys beep faintly in storage, and it takes me right back to that feeling.
The doll. When I was about 10, I had a sleepover at my friend's house. We were watching movies in her room, surrounded by toys, stuffed animals, and a few old dolls her grandma had given her. One of them sat in the corner, on top of a small chest by the window.
It had glass eyes that caught the light in a strange way, and I remember thinking it looked too real. During a quiet scene in the movie, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. It looked like the doll's eyes had shifted, just slightly, like it was looking right at us. I told my friend, but she laughed and said I was just seeing things. We both turned to look again, and it was facing straight ahead, like normal. We tried to forget about it and kept watching. A little later, we heard something fall. The doll was lying on its side in the middle of the room. Neither of us had touched it. My friend picked it up, set it back, and then said, "Let's just put it outside the room." We opened the door, set it in the hallway, and shut the door. After that, we turned the TV back on, but we couldn't relax. The room felt cold and heavy. We kept talking over the movie, pretending everything was fine. Then we heard it. A voice outside the door. It was soft, low, and sounded like a woman whispering. At first, we thought it might be her mom, but when we called out, she didn't answer. The voice came again, closer this time, saying something we couldn't make out. We yelled for her mom, and she came running down the hall. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, except for the doll sitting right against the doorframe, like it had been placed there. Her mom didn't say much, just picked it up and took it away. We didn't hear anything else that night, but neither of us slept much. Even with the lights on, it felt like something was still standing just outside the room.
The door in my room. When I was little, we lived in an old house that had a tiny door built into the wall of my bedroom. It was low to the ground, just big enough for me to crawl through. My mom said it was just a storage space, but I thought of it as my secret fort. I would bring my dolls and a flashlight inside, pretending I was camping or exploring a hidden world. It felt magical at first. The space smelled like dust and old wood, and I loved how quiet it was inside. My mom always said the creaks and groans I heard were just old house sounds or the wind moving through the walls. I believed her. One afternoon while I was playing inside, the little door suddenly swung shut behind me. I thought it was just the air moving through the house, but when I tried to push it open, it would not budge. I started to panic and called for my mom until she came running and opened it. I remember crying and holding on to her, shaking all over. After that, I did not play in there anymore. Some nights, I started to hear what sounded like scratching coming from inside the little door. It scared me, but I still found a bit of comfort in what my mom had told me about old houses making noises. It was not every night, only every now and then. Then one night, I heard something else. It sounded like a child giggling, soft and close, coming from behind that little door. That was enough to make me run to my parents' room and ask to sleep in their bed. Sometimes they let me, but other nights they said I had to stay in my room. I would lie awake, staring at that tiny door, afraid to even blink. I hated that door and the sounds that came from it. Eventually, we moved away from that house, but I have never forgotten it. I do not know what was behind that little door, but I am happy that I never found out.
The restroom in the old hall. When I was in middle school, I attended one of those schools that seemed to carry its age in the walls. The hallways were long and shadowed, the paint chipped in corners no one ever cleaned, and certain areas had that backroom feeling, like they existed just slightly outside of time. My homeroom was tucked away in one of those quiet corridors, far from the usual noise of lockers slamming and students rushing to class. The whole wing felt abandoned, as if the rest of the school had simply forgotten it existed. The restroom there always gave me chills. It was small, dimly lit, and too quiet, with no echoes of laughter or chatter, only a still, heavy silence. I avoided it whenever I could, but one day I could not.
Reluctantly, I raised my hand and asked to go. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the hall, the sound swallowed by the emptiness. When I pushed open the door, the air inside was colder than it should have been. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was just an old building. Old buildings creak and carry strange drafts all the time. I went into a stall, determined to make it quick. That was when I heard it. A low sound. A moan. At first I thought it was just the pipes groaning through the walls, but then it grew louder, closer. I froze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the tiled floor toward my stall. My breath caught. I looked under the door, expecting to see a pair of shoes. Nothing. The footsteps stopped right in front of me. The air seemed to drop in temperature, and my stomach twisted with nausea and panic. Then, the stall door began to shake. I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears, trying to will it away, trying not to scream. For what felt like minutes, I sat trembling, heart pounding so hard it hurt. And then, everything went still again. When I finally opened my eyes, the restroom was empty. The air was heavy and cold, but silent once more. I ran back to my classroom as fast as I could. When I walked in, my teacher looked up right away and asked if I was all right. I just nodded, too shaken to speak. I never used that restroom again. I never told anyone either. But even now, years later, I can still hear that moan echoing in my memory. Sometimes I wonder what it was, the spirit of another child left behind, or something far worse, waiting in that forgotten corner of the school.
The things that wouldn't stay put. The first thing I ever saw move on its own was a small stone figure I kept on my nightstand. I was a teenager, wide awake, laying in bed and staring at it. No pets in the room, no one else awake. I watched it slide, slowly, like someone pushed it with 2 fingers. It reached the edge and fell, hitting the floor hard enough to break. I remember just sitting there, staring at the empty spot where it had been, trying to convince myself I imagined the whole thing. That explanation was easier than the alternative. After that, things started happening more often. Books would fall from shelves when I wasn't near them. Objects I knew I'd placed carefully would be on the floor when I came home. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. Gravity, carelessness, maybe vibrations from someone walking through the house. Except it kept happening. I would leave for school and come back to find items moved. Not missing, not stolen, just relocated. Something that had been centered on a shelf would be angled. Something tucked back would be pulled forward. Once I found a framed picture face down on the floor when it had been sitting flat against the wall that morning. Nothing ever happened in front of anyone else. It was always just me. Always when I was alone or coming back to an empty house. And every time I would stand there for a long moment, feeling watched, listening for something that never made a sound. I stopped keeping breakable things out. I told myself I was being paranoid, and there had to be a reason. The activity followed me through that house. Never violent, never dramatic, just persistent. Like something was there and wanted to be noticed but not seen. When I finally moved away, it stopped. Completely. No more unexplained falls. No more objects out of place. No more walking into a room and knowing immediately that something was wrong before I could explain why. Years later, I still think about that stone figure. About how deliberately it moved. About how nothing like that has happened since. Whatever was in that house stayed there. And I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left.
Thanks for listening to Ghostly Tales. If you enjoyed these stories, please leave us a review.
It helps more listeners find their way into the dark. We'll be back next Wednesday with more tales.